Richard had built an empire from nothing, clawed his way up from poverty to penthouses, convinced that money could solve any problem. He'd bought the best doctors, funded research, offered millions for a compatible donor. But as he sat beside Emma's bed, watching her small chest rise and fall with labored breaths, he understood the cruel truth. All his wealth couldn't buy what she needed most. The National Registry had found no matches. Private searches across the globe had turned up empty. Time was running out, and for the first time in his ruthless career, Richard Carmichael was utterly powerless. Emma stirred, her thin fingers reaching for her father's hand. "Dad," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's okay. I'm not scared." But Richard was terrified. He squeezed her hand gently, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. How could a child face death with such grace while he, a man who'd conquered boardrooms and broken competitors, crumbled inside, miles away from the pristine towers of Manhattan General Hospital? In the shadowed alleys of the Lower East Side, 14-year-old Marcus Reed was fighting his own battle for survival. He'd been living on the streets for 2 years, ever since his mother lost her. Fight with addiction and the foster system had proven more dangerous than sleeping in doorways. Marcus had learned to be invisible, to move through the city like a ghost, stealing food when necessary, finding shelter wherever he could. He trusted no one, needed no one. Trust, he'd learned, was a luxury for people who hadn't been abandoned by everyone they'd ever loved. That evening, as Marcus huddled in his usual spot behind a dumpster, near the hospital's service entrance, he overheard 2 nurses on their smoke break. Their conversation drifted through the November air, words that would normally mean nothing to a kid focused solely on his next meal. "That poor Carmichael girl," one nurse said, shaking her head. 3 days left and still no donor match. It's heartbreaking. Her father's offering $5 million to anyone who's compatible, but money can't create matching bone marrow. I heard she's got such a rare blood type and tissue profile that the odds are astronomical, the other replied. She's a sweet kid, too. Life's not fair. Marcus should have tuned them out. Should have focused on the half-eaten sandwich he'd spotted in the trash earlier. But something made him listen. Maybe it was the age, 12, just 2 years younger than him. Maybe it was the mention of a father who was desperate to save his child. So unlike his own father who disappeared before Marcus could even walk. Or maybe, buried deep beneath the hard shell he'd built around his heart, some tiny ember of his former self still glowed. The next morning, Marcus did something he'd sworn he'd never do. He walked through the hospital's front doors. The warmth inside was almost overwhelming after the November cold, and he suddenly became aware of his torn jacket, his unwashed hair, the smell of the streets clinging to his skin. Security guards eyed him immediately, their hands moving toward their radios. "I'm here about the Carmichael girl," Marcus said quickly, his voice rougher than he intended. "I heard she needs bone marrow. I want to get tested." The guard's expression shifted from suspicion to something like pity. "Son, do you have any idea what bone marrow donation involves? Besides, what makes you think you'd be a match?" Marcus lifted his chin, meeting the guard's eyes with a defiance born from years of being dismissed. "I don't know if I'm a match, but I'm here, aren't I? That's more than nobody." 20 minutes later, after the guards had contacted the transplant coordinator out of sheer desperation, Marcus found himself in a small examination room. Dr. Sarah Chen, a petite woman with kind eyes, explained the testing process while drawing his blood. "I have to be honest with you," she said gently. "The chances of you being a match are extremely slim. Miss Carmichael has a very rare combination of markers. We've tested thousands of people. Just test me," Marcus replied flatly. He didn't believe in miracles or fate or any of that garbage. But he was here, and that had to mean something. The results took 6 hours. 6 hours that Marcus spent in the hospital cafeteria, where a sympathetic nurse brought him a hot meal, the first real food he'd had in days. He watched families come and go, saw their tears and laughter, their obvious love for one another, and felt the familiar ache of loneliness he usually kept buried. When Dr. Chen finally found him, her expression was one of stunned disbelief. "Marcus," she said, her voice shaking slightly, "you're a match. Not just compatible, you're a near-perfect match. I've never seen anything like it in 20 years of practice." The world seemed to tilt. Marcus stared at her, certain he'd misheard. "What?" You can save her life, Dr. Chen continued, tears forming in her eyes. If you're willing to donate, we can do the procedure tomorrow. But I need you to understand what it involves. You'll be under anesthesia, and there will be some pain afterward. And, she hesitated, given your age and situation, we'll need— I'll do it, Marcus interrupted. For the first time in 2 years, he felt something other than numbness or anger. He felt necessary. When? Richard Carmichael had been preparing himself for the worst. He'd written and rewritten Emma's eulogy, made arrangements he couldn't bear to think about, and sat beside her bed watching the clock count down. When Dr. Chen entered with news of a donor, he'd almost collapsed with relief. But when she explained who the donor was, a homeless 14-year-old, boy with no family, no resources, no apparent reason to risk himself for a stranger, Richard felt something shift deep in his chest. I need to meet him, Richard said immediately. Mr. Carmichael, that's not usually— I need to meet him, please. They brought Marcus to a private waiting room. Richard had expected to find fear or calculation in the boy's eyes, some angle he was playing. Instead, he saw a wariness that mirrored his own, and something else, a bone-deep exhaustion that had nothing to do with physical tiredness. Why? Richard asked simply. Why would you do this? Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his jaw working as if chewing on words he'd never spoken aloud. Because I can, he finally said. Because nobody should die when someone can stop, and because— He swallowed hard. Because maybe if someone had given a damn about my mom, she'd still be alive. I can't save her, but maybe I can save your daughter. Richard saw in that moment not a street kid or a charity case, but a young man with more courage and compassion than most people he'd encountered, in boardrooms and country clubs. What's your name? Marcus Reed. Marcus, I'm offering $5 million to the donor. It's yours. You can start over, go anywhere, be anyone. I don't want your money, Marcus cut in sharply. I just want to know that she lives. That's enough. The transplant procedure was scheduled for the next morning. Emma's condition had deteriorated overnight, her time now measured in hours rather than days. As the medical team prepped Marcus, explaining the risks and the recovery process, he remained calm. But when they wheeled him past Emma's room and he caught a glimpse of the small figure in the bed, so fragile, so young, something cracked in his carefully constructed armor. The procedure took 4 hours. They harvested bone marrow from Marcus's pelvic bones, a process that left him groggy and aching when he woke in recovery. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the strange sensation blooming in his chest, something he barely recognized, hope. Emma received the transplant that afternoon. Richard sat beside her through the night, holding her hand, praying to a God he'd never much believed in. Down the hall, Marcus lay in his own bed, refusing the pain medication because he wanted to stay alert, to know the moment they had news. 2 days later, Emma opened her eyes and smiled at her father. Her body was accepting the new marrow. The cells were engrafting, beginning their work of rebuilding her devastated immune system. She would live. When Richard told her about Marcus, about the homeless teenager who had walked into the hospital and saved her life, Emma insisted on meeting him. They wheeled her to his room, still weak but alive, miraculously alive. Thank you, she whispered, tears streaming down her pale cheeks. Thank you for my life. Marcus, this boy who had survived on streets that showed no mercy, who had learned to expect nothing from the world, looked at this girl he'd saved and felt something he thought he'd lost forever. Connection. You're welcome, he said simply. Richard Carmichael was a man used to solving problems with money, but he understood that what came next couldn't be transactional. Marcus, he said carefully, I know you don't want payment, but you gave me my daughter back. Please, let me give you something too. Not money, but a chance, a home, a family if you'll have us. Marcus wanted to refuse. Every survival instinct screamed that this was temporary, that people always left, that caring hurt too much when it inevitably ended. But looking at Emma's grateful smile and Richard's earnest expression, he made perhaps the bravest decision of his young life. He chose to trust. Okay, he said quietly. Okay. The recovery was long for both children. Emma's body slowly accepted its new gift, growing stronger each day. Marcus moved into the Carmichael home, a sprawling apartment he would have once burglarized without a second thought. Richard enrolled him in school, got him counseling to deal with his trauma, and treated him not as a charity project but as a son. There were hard days. Marcus had nightmares about the streets. Emma had setbacks in her recovery. Richard struggled to balance his business with being the father both children needed. But they persisted together. This unlikely family forged not by blood, but by a single act of impossible kindness. A year later, on the anniversary of the transplant, Emma was cancer-free. She'd gained weight, her cheeks were rosy, and her eyes sparkled with life. Marcus had grown 3 inches, filled out, and though the wariness never fully left his eyes, there was warmth there now, too. They celebrated together, the 3 of them, in a quiet acknowledgement of the miracle that had brought them together. "I was wrong," Richard said that night, looking at both children. "I thought money could solve everything. But Marcus showed me that the most valuable things in life, courage, compassion, selflessness, they can't be bought. They're just given freely by people brave enough to care." Marcus shifted uncomfortably at the praise, still unused to being seen as anything but a burden or a problem. But Emma grabbed his hand and he squeezed back. In a city of 8 million people, where countless stories unfold every day, most fade into obscurity. But sometimes, a story emerges that reminds us of humanity's best possibilities. A millionaire's daughter had 3 days to live. A street kid did the impossible. And in saving her life, Marcus Reed discovered that he could save his own, not through wealth or luck or divine intervention, but through the simple, radical act of showing up when someone needed him most.